wherever you're joining us from, and thank you for being here for our diaspora research webinar. My name is Nadia Chanpatadze, and I direct the program on Georgian Studies at the Davis Center, Harvard University. Georgia program has started in 2022 with the research grant from the Ministry of Education and Science, and it was founded by Professor Stephen Jones. Unfortunately, the grant has ended, and from July 2026, the program is changing its format. However, we will still have Georgia-focused programming at Harvard, and please stay signed up for our email list. Via newsletter, we will be sharing news regarding the program and upcoming activities, and you will be finding the link of the email list in the chat. What you should look out for is the Georgian language classes, which will continue on campus and also online through the Harvard Extension School, Georgia seminar series that will be starting in 2026 fall, and library materials that will be accessible through the Harvard University Library, mostly at Fung Library, but also at the Houghton Library, where we recently added 1743 Georgian Bible and other rare materials about Georgia. This project is also part of the Harvard Library, which is named Diaspora Research Project, which also started back in 2022. That was the initiative by Professor Jones, and then last year we managed to sign the memorandum with the association, Georgian Association. So I'm not gonna tell much about the diaspora project because there are plenty of people here in this webinar, and they will be telling not only the story but will be introducing the project. One thing that I want to mention is that the Georgian Association is organizing the first time probably Georgian Days in DC, which will be starting this weekend, and I hope many people will be managing to join it. So without further ado, I would love to introduce today's speakers and also a facilitator. Professor Stephen Jones will be facilitating this conversation, and also will be talking about the Diaspora Project, how it started and developed throughout the years. Professor Jones has served as the founding director of the Davis Center Program on Georgian Studies until summer of 2024, and then afterwards he continued to chair the program's advisory board. He has a PhD from London School of Economics and Political Science and has taught at multiple different universities. His books include Socialism in Georgian Colors, The European Road to Social Democracy, War and Revolution in the Caucasus, Georgia, a Political History Since Independence, and the Birth of Modern Georgia, the First Georgian Republic and its successors, 1918 to 2010. I really would love to flag here his recent book, which also came out with the Harvard University Press, and last week we had the discussion about it at the Davis Center. It's called The First Social Democratic State, and it's about the First Republic of Georgia. Highly recommended book. I'm actually finishing reading this just now. From the Davis Center side, we are also having our own Marcus Waher, who is a RICA student and a Georgia Program Innovation Fellow. Marcus's research is focusing anti-authoritarian resistance in Russia and Belarus. He's originally from Estonia, and he's interested in European security and diplomacy as well. Marcus has conducted research about Georgia and in Georgia in summer 2025. From the Georgian Association, we have Eka Imerlishvili. Eka is a secretary of the Georgian Association. He, in diverse capacities and across the global context, Eka has served in multiple roles throughout her career. She has co-hosted a feminist radio program at the Radio Free Liberty, authored articles on gender, feminism, and democracy, and worked at various international organizations to support civil society, social inclusion, and gender mainstreaming. A Georgian immigrant herself, Eka became interested in learning more about the visionary individuals who fled Bolshevik occupation of Georgia and founded the Georgian Association in 1932. So we also have Diana Zadura, who is independent scholar, graduate of Cultural Anthropology and Eastern Studies, Warsaw University. Diana studied the influence of the Georgian church within national identity, church-state relations, as well as the politics of memory in Georgia. She is currently concentrating on biographical research on Georgian exiles who settled in Poland during the interwar period, with focus on the contract officers in the Polish army. In her free time, Diana translates Georgian. And last but certainly not least, we have Helen Kekelia, who received her PhD from the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia. She most recently served as a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the George Washington University. Her work engages with comparative historical sociology, memory studies, and sociology of exile. For her dissertation, Helen compared the Georgian, Ukrainian, and Azerbaijani exiled communities that fled the Soviet occupation around the 1920s. Previously, she has worked on Soviet sites of memory as well as on the memory of Georgian internally displaced people. She also has a PhD in 2019 from Ilia State University. So we have really wonderful group of speakers, scholars here who will be talking a very important topic about the Georgian diaspora and immigration across the continents. But with all of this, I will pass my virtual microphone to Professor Stephen Jones, who will kick off this conversation. Thank you for joining everybody again.
Natia, thank you so much for the introduction. Welcome everybody, wherever you are in the world. I am very pleased to be chairing this panel. Really exciting materials, original materials. I've looked over all of the presentations that are coming, and I really admire the scholarship that has gone into all three of our presenters' work. So welcome. I think this is going to be really interesting, innovative, and informative. So I'm going to just say a few words as a way of introduction about Georgia and its relationship to migration. Migration, of course, is central to the story of human beings, and it's central, of course, to Georgia's history itself. I was in Georgia in 2005 when migration, history, and identity all got mixed into the discovery of Zvezda and Mzia in Dmanisi in eastern Georgia. Zvezda and Mzia, nicknames for two hominin skulls found in Dmanisi. They were the first African immigrants or migrants, let's say, from 1.8 million years ago into the territory we now call Georgia. President Saakashvili jumped on this discovery and claimed it made Georgians the first Europeans. Georgia, as a small state among acquisitive empires, has always served as either the buffer or the gateway to foreign armies, traders, and refugees. Georgia's history is migration. And as soon as we started the program on Georgian studies here at Harvard in 2022, we decided our first research project should record the history of the Georgian diaspora in the United States. When did Georgians first come to the US? What routes did they follow? Where did they settle? This webinar today is part of this project. The 20th century, characterized by 2 world wars and the destruction of multiple empires, was a particularly intense period of migration for Georgians. This migration came in waves as Georgians fled the devastation of World War I, the Red Army in 1921 when Georgia was invaded. They fled communist rule in the 1920s and the 1930s. They deserted Soviet army ranks during World War II. And more recently, of course, they fled the economic catastrophe of the 1990s and early 2000s in Georgia. This led to at least 861,000 Georgians leaving their homeland between 1991 and 2020. Today, our 3 speakers focus on the journeys of Georgians in the interwar period, that is the period between World War I and World War II. They trace the steps of 3 individuals who followed the major routes out of the Soviet Union. That would be through Poland, maybe through Istanbul, or as one of the presenters will tell us, Harbin in China. These are fascinating stories of courage, of misfortune, and of good luck. It's a narrative largely unknown to Georgians and Americans. The stories illuminate the threads that connect Georgia to waves of global migration driven by war, politics, economics, and increasingly by climate. It's a history we need to tell. Our long-term goal is to create a database of 20th century immigrants to the USA, linked to the joint project of the Georgian Association in the USA and the Georgian Studies Program at the Davis Center at Harvard on the history of the Georgian diaspora in the United States. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first speaker. We're going to have three speakers. They each get about 12 minutes to make their presentation. It will be followed by a map of the individuals that they talked about. At the end, we will come together for discussion and questions. Your questions should go into the Q&A, and we will look at them, and then we will pose them to our presenters. So I'm going to introduce well, they've already been introduced, but let's start with Diana. Diana is going to talk about, as you can see, Vano Nanouishvili, and I'm going to hand it over to Diana now. Looking forward to this. Diana, please start.
Good morning, everyone. I have a little bit tricky task because I will be talking about one person, but also mentioning another character and showing the broader background of Georgian diaspora in Poland. And I've picked a very political example to showcase this time. So Georgian diaspora in interwar Poland was uncommon because of its predominantly military character. And in this group, Ivan Nanouishvili was an exceptional case of politically engaged activist dedicated to exposing Russian imperialism. After the First Democratic Republic of Georgia collapsed in 1921, about 100 of Georgian officers and cadets were recruited by the government of Poland to finish military education and serve in the Polish army. It was the most tangible result of the Polish-Georgian alliance. Georgians believed that they will be able to reclaim their independence soon, and so it was essential to keep young officers well trained and ready to serve Georgia. Many of them were recognized as very good officers. Some received higher military education, Nanouishvili among them. They were integrating well in the society, even more so because they were scattered around the country in different regiments, as well as starting their families. Some Georgian officers had a successful second career in sports, most often in horse racing. But the center of the community life was Warsaw, with the Georgian committee representing both government in exile and caring for the diaspora. It was also with émigrés' contribution that Polish society learned more about Georgia. The first historical sketch on Georgia was written by a Georgian and published by the Eastern Institute, which also hired the first lecturer of Georgian language in Poland, Georgi Nakashice. I will be mentioning him a few times more. It is often the creed and mission of political refugees to bring attention to the fate of their country. This is a poster informing about a public lecture which happened just after the failed national uprising in 1924, Georgia Fighting. Just to give you a sense of it, I'll read you the caption says, Georgia's drowning in blood, 15,000 shot, 40,000 imprisoned or sent to Siberia. The League of Nations is silent. Fight for life and death. Polish-Georgian Brotherhood. Because of their brave fight in defense of Tbilisi, Georgian cadets became very popular among emigrants who saw the potential of this group in generating future national leaders. And Nanouishvili did want to take a leading role. So this is the visible part of his activities. He co-created Georgian Cadets Association, which worked transnationally especially between Poland and France. It was printed in France but edited in Poland with Nanuashvili as the chief editor. But the less visible part of it is that he actually participated in a secret military organization preparing Georgians to a potential next uprising. He was very strongly influenced by Polish political thought, and this is where his and Makashize's paths crossed, because both participated in the Promethean movement, Makashize being the vice president of the Promethean League in Warsaw, which you can see is a visual representation of the movement with the Polish national leader considered to be its patron, and the symbols of 12 nations dominated by Russia, which co-created the movement to unite efforts against the same enemy. The idea was to support cooperation of pro-independence movements, and for this cause, Polish administration provided an umbrella and financial support. What they believed was that it's possible to dismantle Russia along the ethnic borders, providing freedom to the nations, but also seriously weakening Russia itself. And this very movement and political thought had a great influence on Polish Eastern policy, and I would say it still has. So there's a very direct link between this pre-war activities of Nanuashvili and his post-war activism. I will present his biography chronologically in a moment on the map, but now I want to stick to the core of his activism. The first post-war years brought a very hard time for both Georgians and Poles. Disappointed with the result of the war, Soviet Union becomes the winner, Poland loses independence. For Georgians, it became crucial to avoid being captured by Soviets, so most of them are leaving Poland. And recognizing that Georgians had little political representation in the United States, and that United States are becoming the only democratic power able to oppose the Soviet Union, Nanuashvili moves to the East Coast. So now to show you some context, this will be an attempt to visualize Cold War on 2 slides, but in a way that is relevant for the story. The first slide, I want to point to the role of the exiles in the Cold War. Probably all of you heard about Radio Free Europe. This is a leaflet from the fundraising campaign, Crusade for Freedom, which operated in the 50s, but the radio was funded mainly by American administration. And there was also Radio Liberation and Voice of America, with the National Language Services broadcasting to the Soviet Union. And within these huge projects under American umbrella, East European and Soviet exiles were carrying out peaceful political action. In other words, American government recognized the usefulness of the exiles for American intelligence and propaganda. And this is where the interests of America and the captive nations coincided. Nanuashvili saw it as an opportunity. And this is exactly why he decided to move to America, although he never benefited from American support. And the second slide on Cold War is to talk about the concept of captive nations. The concept got popular in the 50s. It was known in Poland and in Europe much earlier, but in America in the 50s, when American people were invited to observe Captive Nations Week, as established by public law, which was a way to reaffirm American commitment to supporting nations striving for liberty. It was also a useful way to pack the national issues of different nations into a wider category that would give them more visibility and recognition. And this very category was also used by Nanuashvili in his writings. As soon as he came to America, he started establishing this non-partisan organization. Its aim was to advocate for the Georgian cause, but also to look for ways of cooperation with local exiles from the captive nations, as well as with Americans. And this is the direct link with the Promethean movement, I would say. The idea that was so close to him was that captive nations should create a united front and act in a coordination against the same enemy. And this is the organization that was behind the first Georgian language periodicals in the United States, although poor quality and duplicated. He became a very active publicist. He was writing mainly to exile periodicals, but he was also known for this very book. At the time, he was presenting himself as a military expert, writing about geopolitics, political military history, in the context of always in the context of Russian imperialism, and quite accurately exposing Soviet tactics. He believed that military conflict between the West and Soviet Union is inevitable, argued that Soviet Union can be defeated if its weaknesses are used against it, and that there could be no lasting peace as long as Russia exists as an empire. These are on the left. You can see the examples, the titles of some of the articles he published. His works did get some recognition, although limited. Especially the second edition of this book received some positive reviews. But I want to tell that, of course, the scale of this work and the impact was also limited, because the work he did was kind of grassroots kind of work, I would say. He was funding his activism from savings, even actually getting indebted to publish this book. And he was sending this book to decision and opinion makers, senators, congressmen, trying to make his mark. This book was not available in bookshops. And in this way, he was trying to get through with his expertise, also actually, and interestingly, contacting American intelligence and trying to talk to them about his expertise and his insight. In 1959, this time, George Nakashidze gave a testimony before the Committee of Un-American Activities regarding crimes of Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And in this speech, in this testimony, Nakashidze was targeting also kind of using the occasion to target not only Soviet propaganda and economic exploitation, but also Russification in Georgia. So he was kind of trying to use this occasion again to advocate for Georgia. And he gave a very good speech, but also quite boldly expressed his disillusionment with the Western policies towards the Soviets. So these two, the second one being a report, special report of the Select Committee on Communist Aggression, but specifically talking about Georgian case. These two, which is based also on testimonies of Georgians in the United States, are interesting and rare documents showcasing Georgians' advocacy in the United States. But in a broader context, this is also a story of political émigrés' contribution to the Cold War efforts, defending the right to national self-determination and exposing Russian/Soviet expansionism. I'm not sure how much time I have more. This is about what I wanted to say before I show the map. At the end, I would like to say that in this generation of Georgians, and particularly in this group of Georgian Polish officers, although most of them never came back to Georgia, and Nanuishvili came back symbolically for the first time when his private archive was donated to be stored in Georgia, and it is stored in the National Center of Manuscripts in Tbilisi. And for the second time, he came back when his book was rediscovered or discovered by Georgians, and it was translated into Georgian and reprinted also in English version, so that now it's accessible in Georgia in both versions. So if we could go to the map now. Right, so this is our map, and I'll tell you a few more details about the trajectory of his migration. Nanuashvili was raised in Tbilisi, and he was a cadet in the military college in Free Georgia, Independent Georgia. Before he had to join Georgian government, escaping the Georgia being invaded by Bolsheviks in 1921. So they stopped in Istanbul for about 8 months before they were given the permission. They were received in different military colleges around Europe, and specifically Nanuashvili was accepted to join military college in Greece, where he stayed for about a year, and then he had to be transferred to Poland to join the biggest group of Polish cadets being educated in Poland. So he's finishing his military education in Poland and joins infantry in Bydgoszcz, and then changes regiment. He gets higher military education in Warsaw for another 2 years. And this is exactly the period where he becomes interested with politics, and he co-founds the Georgian Cadets Association, and its organ is being published, the Hedari magazine, The Rider. He changes regiments, goes to on the east of Poland to the town of Yarosław, and rises to the rank of captain, also participating in the September campaign in defense of Poland, which of course failed, as we know, and he becomes, as many other Georgian officers, he becomes a prisoner of war, and spends about 1.5 years in German camps for prisoners of war. Murna was a camp for Polish army officers, but then he was transferred to more other camps. Before he was, thanks to influential Georgians in Berlin, he was released and comes back to Poland. So he settles in Poznań and keeps a low profile in this town, trying to figure out what he can do in this very situation, which was tricky enough because he didn't want to cooperate with Germans. He was pressured to cooperate with Germans, but refused. And in 1.5 years, he figured out a way to cooperate with Germans, but not to cooperate with them. I think it was a way to use Germans actually for his own sake. So he volunteers. He goes via Berlin. He goes to Berlin and he volunteers as a driver to the Legion Speer, German transportation corps consisting of foreigners, and delivering supplies to the German army around Europe. So he drives with them. He drives to Italy, and then on a fortunate occasion escapes and crosses the front to join Polish troops under British command. He participates in the Battle of Boulogne, for which he's awarded the Polish Cross of Valor. So the war ends, and tens of thousands of Polish officers and soldiers are being demobilized and transferred to United Kingdom, where within the framework of Polish Resettlement Corps, they are adjusting to civil life. They're learning English and trying to learn civil professions. He stays there for about 4 years before he decides to move to the United States, specifically recognizing that this is the best place where he can fight Soviet Union and advocate for the Georgian cause. He works physically, but co-creates the American Council for Independent Georgia and publishes his articles on the spread of communism and the potential role of captive nations in curbing Russian imperialism. He struggles financially, and for that reason, he changes location, hoping to find a better place in San Francisco. And this is where he lives by the end of his life. And this is at the very end, some more of his work is actually being recognized. He was very proud that one of the reviews were actually printed in American magazine Military Affairs, and he's awarded an honorary position on the board of directors of the National Captive Nations Committee. So this is about it. Thank you.
That was wonderful. As I said, lots of new material that feeds into our project on the diaspora, and we hope to take this much further and create a real database of all these individuals who made these amazing journeys right across Europe in the interwar period and after. Okay, thanks, Diana. Now I'm going to ask Elena to talk about her work on the Georgians, many of them ending up in Louisville in France. And Elena's worked a lot on the community in Louisville. So Elena, let's listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me start by sharing my presentation. I'm just making sure the presentation works. Does the presentation work? Everybody
Yes.
can see. Okay.
Yes.
So today I will be presenting my work on the Georgian émigrés in France and also the extraordinary journey of Alexander Jareli. And part of this presentation is founded on my dissertation work, and part is based on an extensive archival research on the Jareli case. And I first of all want to thank the Jareli family, Luca, the great-grandson of Alexander, and his entire family for trusting me with their family memory. A detailed academic publication will follow for those who are interested in the details of the Jareli story. So I want to start by describing what kind of community was the Georgian émigré community in France. And the first thing I want to mention is that this was a very small community in numbers. The first wave of Georgians were probably around 1,200 exiles, and some records even indicated there were around 600 or 800 Georgians. And now compared to Russians or Ukrainians who are in hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands, this is a very small number. So who are these people? I consider these people as post-colonial intellectuals and nationalist elites who are very skillfully advocating for Georgia. And despite their small population size, the community is very potent. When we think of exile, we imagine powerlessness, and even the possibility that exiles could have any agency or voice is questioned. But my research shows that these Georgians were very actively using their voice and even challenging Western countries. Georgians had an official legation that gave them a more potent political presence, so they often led official meetings with politicians around Europe or in the League of Nations. Now, in my work, I analyzed historical documents and émigré journals, and this is the picture that emerges. Georgian émigrés produce an alternative account, an émigré memory of 4 different narratives: a memory of occupation and independence, the civilized, the victorious nation, and the politics of differentiation. So the first thing is that the exiles promote the idea that Georgia was an independent country that was occupied. So it's a tragic narrative frame. Then they inscribe themselves as part of the civilized world, and they argue for their eligibility for international protection. They challenge the great powers by identifying who is civilized and who is obligated to help them. The third one is the victorious nation, which is the idea that the exiles refused to be the losers and presented themselves as victorious while portraying the Bolsheviks as losers. They kept this hopeful tone about the end of the Soviet rule and the liberation of Georgia. And finally comes the politics of differentiation. And this is when Georgians really amplify their requests to be differentiated from Russians. One quote I particularly like that illustrates this approach or this narrative is from an administrative officer who depicts how Georgians insist on distinctive treatment, and as you can see in this slide. Georgian émigrés look very different from the Soviet Georgians that are depicted by Eric Scott. While the Soviet Georgians employed a policy of differentiation towards all other ethnic groups, and they presented themselves as exotic and unique, another kind of differentiation emerges in France, one that targeted Russians exclusively. Émigré Georgians advocated for a modern understanding of statehood and citizenship and claimed to be part of the civilized European family, from which they excluded Russians as imperialists. If Georgians in the Soviet Union achieved a narrative of success, the émigré community also invited the title of a victorious nation while characterizing the situation in Georgia as tragic and miserable. So their victorious narrative was rooted in tragedy. This is the picture that emerges on the self-perceived or projected identity of the Georgians in Lviv. And to go back to the idea of agency, the Georgian émigrés truly remarkably advocated for themselves. They had claims, they influenced international politicians, and created an émigré memory that would become an available past for independent Georgia. And this community could even serve as inspiration for modern-day diasporas. Now, moving to the second part of the presentation, I want to introduce Ether Jareli, born in 1925 in Paris. She was part of the Lviv émigré community, and I was fortunate to interview her in 2011 when she told me Alexander's story. She recounted that as a child, it was her duty to bring meals to Ektime Taraishvili, whom everybody here recognizes. She would compete with other Georgian children over this task because she adored Ektime and was honored to do so. Ektime taught her a long list of how to be Georgian or what it means to be Georgian, and even as a child, she could recognize the grandeur of Ektime. At some point, Ektime is sheltered by the Jareli family in Belgium. He lives with Alexander for a year and a half and teaches little Otar Georgian. Otar is Alexander's son, who eventually marries Eteri. In this picture, Eteri is holding a portrait of her father-in-law, Alexander. This is Alexander with his wife Nina and Otar. The first picture is in Tbilisi, and the second picture is later on in Belgium once they are exiled. Alexander was the main shareholder of the Chemo company, pictured here, and the company had gone international and was closely collaborating with Germans and other international dealers. In the 1920s, among all known manganese deposits in the world, the Chiatura deposit was one of the largest and produced the highest grade of ore. And Georgia provided half of the world's supply of this ore at that time. After the occupation of Georgia, Chemo had to cede some of its shares to the Soviet Union, but it still managed to survive as a semi-independent company. In 1924, negotiations emerged involving American businessman Averell Harriman, and Jageli managed to secure an agreement with Harriman, who decided to enter the international mining industry. Now, who's Harriman? Harriman is an important American figure. He's the son of a rail magnate, but he's not only a businessman. Later on, he was the US ambassador to the UK and the USSR. He held various political positions, including serving as a special envoy during World War II and negotiating with Stalin. At that time, in the 1920s, only 2 American private firms were operating in the Soviet Union under special contracts. The manganese concession in Soviet Union remained the only major American industrial investment in the Soviet Union during these years. This is also a time when the US has not yet recognized the Soviet Union, and American businesses were cautiously exploring Soviet markets despite the absence of formal diplomatic relations. Eventually, in 1925, and you can see in this first picture of the contract, Harriman entered into a 20-year agreement with the Soviet Union to mine and export manganese ore. This concession, which is signed against the backdrop of the failed 1924 rebellion and its repressions, is hailed by the Western press as a major event, congratulating Americans on their business and also portraying the Soviet Union as a reliable international business partner. Harriman even travels twice to Giatura as he passes in Moscow. Now, in 1928, the deal failed and the contract had to be terminated. This happened after 1 year of sour battle and sour negotiations following the Soviet Union's breach of terms, which prevented Harriman's company from operating properly. Once Jageli learned of the contract termination, he began organizing a lawsuit with other owners against Harriman. When it became clear that Harriman Company must leave the country, the company decided to disregard the owners' rights and prioritize saving their investments in the business. A string of documents show how Harriman, Robinson, and others discussed their liabilities to the owners. They were aware of their liabilities, but they decided to keep the owners in the dark and save their investment. Now, Alexander's story remains fascinating and relatable even 100 years later because it touches on exile, advocacy, tariffs, leverage, and émigré agency. He was navigating a very difficult situation. The Red Army had occupied his country. One of his sons participated in the rebellion. The Soviets had targeted his international successful business, and his family was held hostage by Beria. While such a distress was tragically common in the Soviet Union, what made Alexander's case exceptional was the leverage and influence that he possessed. He attempted to use this influence to pressure the Soviet Union by demonstrating his connections and importance to the American actors, while simultaneously trying to persuade Americans, especially Hoover, to act against the Soviet Union. Harriman, however, was not his natural ally in this, since his primary concern remained his own business interests. And this endeavor brings Jageli to the US multiple times, starting from the 1930s, and now we are going to follow his trajectory on the map. Oh yeah, I don't see the little, yeah, thank you. Can you pull it up a little bit? So yes, thank you. So Alexander was born in a noble family in Kutaisi, and when his father learned about his business, he chased him out of the house, believing that being a salesman was not a nobleman's job. In the end, they reconciled. Alexander started the Chemo Company with many other shareholders, and he was also a philanthropist. He privately gave away around 100 scholarships to Georgian students to study abroad in Germany. Alexander and his wife lived on Rustaveli Avenue and had a total of 7 children. 2 daughters did not survive. And eventually, once the family fled Georgia, this home was confiscated. Now, this is when Jareli helps Harbin and accompanies him in Moscow to renegotiate the fixed royalties with the Soviet Union. They are successful. They managed to renegotiate. This is also the time the family recounts that he was summoned by Stalin. He meets Stalin, and Stalin gives him some sort of weapon as a gift. But the next one, please, the next location. But the day after his return in Tbilisi, he's jailed and is asked to give up his property rights, which he refuses. The Soviets try to sell the goods with his signature, but his international clients disagree, and eventually the Soviets have to free him. Now, this marks the start of his exile. He passes through France. He then goes to London, where he meets Robinson, who is Harbin's associate, to negotiate his shares and manganese-related businesses in London. I do have to mention that Harbin helps him to secure funds to start his exile. Now, the next location is interesting because this tells the story of the exile of Nina and her sons and illustrates how hard it was to escape Georgia. Nina initially asked Beria to let her go, which he declined. Nina told Beria that they would still leave, to which Beria responded ironically that you cannot even go from your own residence to the postal office without a carriage, and how are you going to leave Georgia? It seemed surreal, unimaginable to him. But Alexander had already hired a Latin American cook to train the family to walk long distances. They train for months, maybe even for a year. Then the Batumi smugglers help Nina and his sons escape through the Adjara Mountains on foot. Little Otar, who's now 9 years old, has his father's pistol, and when his mom got cold and the smugglers denied making fire out of precaution, Otar threatened them with a pistol. The fire was built, which attracted the Soviet guards' attention. Fighting and running followed, and Otar got wounded mildly but survived. Alexander eventually greets them in Turkey, and once the family is safe in Belgium, Nina sent an ironic telegram to Beria. We arrived safely. Now, this is also a time in Brussels where Eptime temporarily joined and lived with the Jareli family. Now, this marks the start of many trips to the United States, of Jareli's trips to the United States to pursue the lawsuit against Harbin and his company. For the next 5 years, he will persistently go back to the US for this reason. He is organizing paperwork for many other shareholders who will also benefit from this lawsuit. The lawsuit is successful enough that Harbin and company decides to relocate their main office in Delaware to take advantage of the statute of limitations. Eventually, Harbin settles the lawsuit, and Jareli is compensated for his loss. And some of the pictures that you see here are actual pictures of the ships with which he traveled, of the hotels where he stayed, and the places he visited, the ports he visited in the UK or France. And finally, Jareli's final destination is in Belgium, where he passes around 1939 and 1914. His 2 sons join the Allied force and fight in World War II, but both of them survive. Thank you.
Elena, thank you so much. Again, fascinating work and extraordinary images that you must have spent a long time trying to find in the archives. So thanks for that really interesting part of Georgian history. So Eka,
My pleasure.
I'm going to turn to you, and you're going to tell us all about the Chinese route.
Thank you. I will, as soon as the slides are coming through. Thank you. Yes, so unlike the many Georgian immigrants who migrated to the United States through European routes, as we just heard, there is a lesser known group of Georgians who went from Georgia all the way across the Russian Empire and into China. Their paths are sometimes overlooked, but their stories are equally interesting. They sometimes have spent years building their lives and careers there before continuing their journeys to America. But we cannot discuss China and Chinese route without mentioning the Chinese Eastern Railway, which was a Russian concession built between 1897 and 1903 in a very short amount of time, connecting Siberia with Manchuria. These T-shaped train lines, as you see on your right side, connected Vladivostok on the right side with Manjuli on the left side and Dalian on the south, and they all intersected in a city called Harbin, which at that point, at the beginning of the construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway, was not a city, but this construction turned into a major administrative and cosmopolitan center. The railway attracted thousands of immigrants, migrants, labor migrants mostly, from across the Russian Empire, including Georgians, who went there to work as laborers, manual workers, as well as business owners to support the construction and the needs that people had as business owners, and helped transform Harbin into a rapidly growing European city that became known for its culture, trade, and of course as a big transit area. So this is where we kind of start talking about the Georgians in Harbin, because in the beginning, as early as 1908, we have one of the strongest and wealthiest Georgian diaspora organization in Harbin. It was founded by a famous businessman, Iuliane Haindrava, in 1908, who led the organization for about 30 years. The organization was initially set up to support incoming Georgians, mostly in the beginning labor migrants, but later after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, those who fled the Bolshevik Revolution, as well as Georgians who left Georgia after the failed 1924 uprising. The Georgian Diaspora Organization, or colony, as they were often called at that time, had their own building, language school. They organized events, public holidays, and led the city's religious life for Georgians for decades. The colony had very close ties with other Georgian immigrant communities globally, and especially after the 1921, and where they were often featured in émigré publications. For example, this screenshot on your right side is of a newspaper excerpt from Damokidebeli Sakartvelo, which was coming out in Paris by émigrés, Georgian émigrés, that says a letter from Harbin. And it is a kind of update of what Georgian colony in Harbin was doing, specifically that they had organized a religious service at the Orthodox Saint Sophia Church in Harbin to honor the memory of Patriarch Ambros Sichelaya, who had passed away just a few months before this letter was published. Georgians overall were very active also in the Harbin community. They had positions within the city, or they were otherwise engaged with the city affairs. They, of course, worked on the Chinese Eastern Railway, and operated businesses like drugstores, cafes, restaurants, and were otherwise very known in the diaspora community in Harbin, which at that point had diaspora from, as I said, other parts of the Russian Empire. So this is where we kind of meet individuals that I'll be talking about today. And our first individual is this young woman, Tamara Georgikia. The year is 1921, and Tamara Georgikia on your right is 20 years old. She is preparing for her move to the United States. And as part of her journey and move, she has gotten her passport from Georgian consulate in Vladivostok of independent Georgia a year before her trip. She had translated her school graduation documents from Russian into English and had spent 6 months in Qingdao, China, waiting for her visa to the US. And she had finally gotten a visa, and on April 21st, 1921, she boards this ship, steamship Shinyu Maru, and heads to the US. She's going to San Francisco. It takes her about a month to arrive in San Francisco, and she is due to attend a school there, just like a friend of hers, also from China, who had left a year ago and had arrived at the same school where she's due to attend, and on whose guidance she is very much relying for the next few months in this new country. So Tamara Georgikia who is Tamara Georgikia? She was born just 2 weeks into the 20th century, middle of January 1901, in Zugdidi, Georgia. We don't exactly know why and when her parents moved her to Harbin, China, but we know that as early as 1915, she's already attending an all-girls gymnasium in Harbin, a very famous gymnasium at that time, because we've seen her transcripts that she later translates for her paperwork as part of her move to the United States. So soon after graduation, she basically is graduating the school. She's getting ready for her move. And then after arriving to the US, she spends a couple of semesters in California attending the school, and moves then afterwards to New York and enrolls at Cornell University. She meets another Georgian there on the photo on your right side, a man on the right side, who is also a Georgian. His name is Pavle Kvaratshelia. He was at Cornell on a Georgian government scholarship, and they both meet each other there and marry just a year or so after meeting. They do have 2 daughters, Nina and Elizabeth, and settle in upstate New York, most likely due to Pavle's work at Plant Research Institute that had headquarters in Yonkers, New York, where they moved. Tamara immediately starts getting very actively involved in the city affairs. She joins parent-teacher groups, various clubs, hosts their meetings, is often voted as president or vice president of those clubs, hosts Georgians who are most of them are living on the East Coast at that time. And as someone who had grown up in China and Harbin, which, as I've summarized, had a very active Georgian diaspora life, she comes up with the idea to found a similar Georgian organization, Georgian colony in the United States. So in 1932, together with other Georgians and her husband, she co-founds the Georgian Association in the US. And becomes its 5th president in 1947. We'll leave her here, and then we can continue a little bit about her other parts of her journey when we switch to the map in a bit. But we can move on to another Georgian who also came from China to the US, and the year is 1947, so 26 years after Tamara had come to the US. And we meet Iliko Merabishvili, who in 1947 is 37 years old. He had spent about 20 years in China, but it's the end of the World War II. The geography and the political alliances globally are being redrawn. And he thinks it's time to leave China, that had become a communist country, and make his way to the United States. So in summer of 1947, he boards a plane, a Pan-American flight, transatlantic flight, in Shanghai, and with his 5-month pregnant wife, flies to San Francisco via Manila and Honolulu. The two of them enter United States, Honolulu first, and then San Francisco at the end of July 1947, and they both enter as stateless persons. And Iliko Merabishvili becomes Alex Merabishvili. We don't have time right now to discuss all those details and how that happened and why that happened, but I'll be happy to pick that up during Q&A, and we can discuss that. But for now, we can meet Iliko. And the first glimpse we have into who he is from the silent movie that I'll play right now, which is from 1927. It's called Bella. And we see Iliko here on this little clip. He was born and raised in Georgia and was discovered during a school talent search and cast in silent cinema as a teenager, as early as 14-year-old. After this film, he continued to play in various films until 1929, when he leaves Georgia at the height of his career, after playing in Gadfly or Razanat, as we all know in Georgia. Per his own account, he leaves Georgia because a handful of his family members were executed after failed 1924 uprising against Soviet government. He himself gets arrested, gets kicked out of the university, and fearing further retribution, he decides it's time to leave Georgia. Other researchers, by other researchers' accounts, which are to be trusted, definitely, he follows a woman he fell in love with during her dance tour in Tbilisi a few years prior. She is married and has a young child, and Iliko follows her wherever she goes to perform throughout Soviet Union. And until the two of them decide to flee together to Harbin, China, where, as we know, a Georgian and Russian community was thriving. So once in China, they hop around the cities, Harbin, Shanghai, Tianjin, opening and closing, couple of entertainment businesses, shops, restaurants, cabarets, while dancing and performing either solo or together. Iliko adopts a stage name Iliko Azbegi when performing Georgian dances throughout the cities in China between 1930, when they first arrived in China, until 1947, as I said, when he left. But sometimes in between that time, around mid-1930s, his partner, who he eloped and left Soviet Union for, expressed her interest in receiving a Soviet passport and citizenship. And indeed, around that time, Soviet Union was actively offering passports to people and to those who had left Soviet Union and were residing in China. At some point, even working on the Chinese Eastern Railway conditional to Soviet citizenship. So it is no surprise that this would be an ongoing conversation among Georgian diaspora in China at that time. But obviously, Iliko is not comfortable with that. And this might have been a reason why the two split. They changed cities, they moved into different cities. And in 1946, Iliko marries a China-born Georgian beauty, as he later talks about her. And the two of them board a plane to San Francisco. Iliko had, as a former movie star, had always wanted to go to Hollywood. So I think that's how he ended up making his way all the way to China, to San Francisco, to California. So once he comes to United States in 1947, their son, Archil, is born just a couple of months after. We don't know much about what the couple was doing up until their citizenship in 1953. But as soon as they receive their citizenship, the two open a restaurant in San Francisco called Alexis Tangier. You see the interior of the restaurant on your screen. It immediately becomes a place to be seen and see and be seen. And in the 1953 newspapers, it is dubbed as a place, receives a high praise from socialites of the time, and even is dubbed as perhaps the most fabulous and romantic spot to dine in San Francisco. Its decoration and design, interior design is splendid, as you can see. But a lot of gold, opulence. There are some Georgian-looking statues even on the left of it. Though at the back of this postcard that you're seeing on your screen, it says that it had a Byzantine splendor. So it has that ambience. While it was never a Georgian restaurant. It had a lot of Georgian dishes on the menu. Even a cocktail menu had a Georgian cocktail on it called suliko, or darling and dear, as Iliko himself had mentioned on the cocktail menu. So the restaurant becomes this place, as I had mentioned, to see and be seen. For example, a Duke and Duchess of Manchester in 1958 dined there, and it's covered by a local newspaper. Hollywood actors and actresses and all the rich and famous go there all the time. Iliko himself becomes very famous in San Francisco scene. He is known for his exquisite taste and hosting skills, and he's very chivalrous with his guests. He's often voted as the best dressed man in the city. But he's also a smart businessman, and just a few years after opening his restaurant, he hires a publicist as someone to help him generate a buzz about his restaurant. And thanks to that person, and also all the coverage he was receiving in local newspapers and magazines, both about wine and food and travel, he has a lot of connections. And one of those connections is with the San Francisco city mayor, with whom Iliko mentions about his mom and how much he would like to see her. And San Francisco city mayor makes it happen. He advocates and talks with Nikita Khrushchev to allow Iliko's mom to travel from Soviet Union in mid-1960s all the way to San Francisco. And that event is also heavily covered by local newspapers. And the two meet, of course, and then she continues to come back again and again a few years later to San Francisco. Iliko expands his business in 1960s, adds a discotheque to the restaurant, and has plans for opening kind of restaurants in Europe. Some of his current restaurants branches or under somewhat similar name. Plans to also open a chateau where exquisite wines will be imported, as well as starting, like some places in Hawaii and Europe, and a chateau. But after 20 years of operating his restaurant, in 1972, he sells his restaurant, this particular restaurant, to his longtime client, and retires at the age of 63, with plans to move to Hawaii. I will stop here and give you a little bit more of his journey through the map, and add a bit more visuals to his journey. Yeah, so we can start with Chamar Georgikia, who, as I had mentioned, was born in Zugdidi at the beginning of the 20th century, most likely to a nobleman and someone who may have also been a jewelry maker, as her obituary mentions. We don't know how long she stayed in Zugdidi, but we know that already in 1915, she is in Harbin. and is going to this particular school that we see. This school was a Russian woman-owned school, very famous, in a very beautiful building. Yeah, she goes there. All the famous and rich and famous in Harbin attend that all-girls gymnasium. Later and graduates from 1919 and becomes a tutoress. That's what her graduation documents mention. We still don't know how she ends up in China, in California, or why. I mean, we know she's going there for a school, but how that became to be is not clear to us just yet. But as I had mentioned, she's waiting. She's in Qingdao, China for 6 months, most likely preparing and waiting for her visa documents to come through. And that passport photo of hers is also very interesting because it's issued by an independent Georgian consulate in Vladivostok, and by the person who later becomes a head of the Georgian colony in Harbin and moves to the United States also a few years later. Then we meet her again in California, where she attends a school for a couple of semesters before making her way to Cornell and meeting her future husband, Paul Guaratshelia, there. As I had mentioned, Paul was there on a scholarship by Georgian government. And he is said to have been one of the 84 students who declined Soviet government's offer to continue paying their education fees after the Bolshevik occupation of Georgia. But they marry and they have 2 daughters, as I had mentioned. Their house in Yonkers becomes a gathering place of many Georgians. Georgian diaspora, Georgian association was also christened there, so to speak, and had a big gathering at their house. And this photo is of their house. Their daughters are in the middle, much older, yeah, they are said to have become like a family that everyone wanted to go to and be with. And her husband was also the first president of Georgian Association. And in 1950s, her husband retires and the couple moves to Florida. According to researchers, they wanted to move to Florida because it reminded them of Black Sea and Zugdidi, and more tropical area. That's why they moved there. And she lives there until her husband's passing in 1973, after which she moves to Connecticut and stays there for about 17 years. We don't know much, again, what she was doing there, but she becomes very well known there, again, in some clubs and city affairs, and is known as a very avid bridge player until her death in 1994. So that's about Tamara. We can continue on to
Echo, can we be very quick so we have some time to ask the
yeah,
audience?
sure. We don't have to go into Alex. We can just switch to questions.
Yeah, I think probably that's best. We've got about 15 minutes, 17 minutes left. And that again was just a fascinating story, such an unusual one. Through China, Georgian film star, and a young woman traveling, in the most difficult times there, to the US. What a courageous person she must have been. So we've got a little time to ask questions. I've got tons of questions, but I think I should turn first to the Q&A to see what we have there. And we have only right now just one question, but I'm hoping that others will pop up. So it's Georgi Miladze, and he's asking, well, did all these people who came to the US, was there any way in which they connected with one another? Do we know of any connections between these émigrés? I mean, they're very disparate, different countries, different places, and so on. But any connections? And that's an open question to everybody.
I can
Okay,
take
yeah.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead.
I mean, as someone who is a Georgian association, I feel like sometimes we have a bit more kind of an umbrella view to what was happening in the United States at that time. And yes, for example, we know that Ivan Nanuashvili was in contact with Georgian Association. And whenever he was publishing some of his articles, he would send it to Georgian Association and say, hey, this is what I published.
Okay.
For example, on that level.
Right, right. Of course, the Georgian Association in the USA was the magnet, right, for Georgian émigrés, or at least Georgian émigrés in the US of a certain class, let's say, because the Georgian émigrés who come to the US after World War II are former prisoners of war, often in the infantry and in the Red Army, and a different type of social background than the original Georgian wave in the 1930s. Okay, Diana's got a hand up. Diana, comment. Yeah.
I just recently discovered that Pavle Kvaratskhelia had something to do with Twentieth, the organ of the American Council for Independent Georgia, which was co-created by Nanuashvili. Of course, there were other Georgians as well behind it, but Pavle Kvaratskhelia is mentioned. I can't recall where exactly, but perhaps he used to be on the editorial board for a while.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Elena.
Well, yes, on my end, Alexander never really settled in the US, but he's definitely in touch with French émigrés. And just to put this question in the perspective of the French emigration, the Georgians in Lviv are definitely coordinating and in touch with especially the Promethe movement and other Georgians and Caucasians and Azerbaijani exiles, because especially the ones who are working on this political coordination and advocacy, they were working together. For example, the Azerbaijani community who was working with the Georgians, they also were split between Istanbul and Paris. Topçubaşı was in Paris, and they had a strong coordination. And so the Georgians from France were definitely coordinating with others across Europe.
Yeah, excellent. Very good. So we have another question. Hold on, it's just scrolled itself out of my vision. It's from Tsitsi Lobjanidze. Are the descendants of these immigrants known at all? Where do they live now, and do they ever come to Georgia? I'm wondering if any of you found any information about their descendants.
So my answer is the easiest one, because Nanuashvili didn't marry, and to my knowledge, she had no heirs.
Right. Elena?
As for the Cagheli family, actually Eteri and Otar, they come back to Soviet Georgian in 1967 because they are in love with the idea of homeland and Georgia. They are raised by basically Ekutime Taghaishvili, who instills all these ideas about loving the homeland and Georgia. And eventually this is one of the few families who travels back and settles back in Soviet Georgia. And so Otar's descendants are now living in Tbilisi, and the family has shared their memories with me. But Otar's brothers' descendants are Kukuri's descendants, or George officially, are living in Spain.
A question that follows up on that. This is from Nino Gozalishvili. Very interesting aspect of Georgian history indeed, she says. Thank you all. Could you please touch upon the matter of belonging for these people? Do we have any understanding whether they considered themselves to be part of a European US society, and how would that be articulated? So a question of identity. How did they see themselves, although they were exiles in Europe or the US? Elena.
So for the Georgian émigrés in France, from my studies, what I've seen is that they truly consider themselves part of the European family. They truly, culturally, civilization-wise, believe that they are part of the European family. And this is the identity that they carry with them. So they don't consider themselves as an exotic little ethnicity, Georgians who are different from everybody else, but they consider themselves truly as part of the European civilization and European family. At least this is the narrative that comes out of thousands of pages of historical documents, letters, and newspapers, immigrant newspapers that I have analyzed. So this is to the extent to which I can respond to the identity question, and it was part of my presentation as well.
Excellent, thank you. Eka.
Thank you. I have not had a chance to ask the question to the descendants of the two people I spoke about, but I had recently had a conversation with someone who might be at this call today with us. And then she did mention, even though she wasn't born in Georgia and grew up to a Georgian father, that she considers herself a Georgian. So just an anecdote that I wanted to share from someone I spoke with recently.
Okay, thanks. Diana?
So for Nanuashvili specifically, I don't have this kind of documents, or he doesn't write about it so much. I think he thought of himself as a Georgian from the beginning till the end, although he was well assimilated in Poland especially, but in America I don't think so much. But I want to say that on the background of the whole group, like many of them who lived in Poland, and especially those who had Polish wives, and if they had descendants, they would, many of them, see themselves as Polish, even if they left Poland. And
right. It's interesting to see on Nanuashvili's book. He says Jan Nanuashvili.
Yeah. He's using, because he was known among Polish people as with his Polish kind of colonized name. And in fact, this is also an interesting thing, because I know one case when a Georgian took another surname. So he had Georgian Polish surname, that he used his nick from the underground in fighting in Poland. So I think that's a complex issue, that identity.
Yeah, it is. And you know, shifting names, changing names is, of course, very common among émigrés who are trying to adapt, right, and trying to fit into wherever they're living. So there's one more question here from Shlomo Tarba, but before we get to it, there's a question I want to ask that I don't want to let go, and that's a question about sources. Where did you all go to get this information? And how difficult was it to find this information? Dinah, why don't we start with you?
Many sources. I chose the topic and I chose this character because I knew that I will find the sources. Basically, I knew that it would not be a lost time. But I think I decided on it when I learned that his private archive is in Georgia, which I haven't fully looked through, I admit, because I was concentrating on the Polish connection and the Polish part of the archive that I've seen so far. But then I was trying to fill the voids, of course, with Polish sources. So also Polish military archive, but also immigration archives in London and New York, because there were huge Polish diasporas, and they have their archives, rich archives. So and again also digital libraries, Georgian library, and of course Georgian sources, like new sources on Georgian immigration.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. It must have been, tough job finding those images and such. And it was just really, how you got them must have been a story in itself. So anyway, thanks for that. Elena.
So for me, the Library of Congress has an abundance of materials about Harriman. So Library of Congress, also National Archives, the Hoover Archives in Stanford, but also the Hoover Presidential Library, the Coolidge Presidential Library, Ancestry for all the travels, and what else? The Georgian archives, which I have not yet fully explored, the family memory, and then Harvard's repository for some of the old images. And I hope I remember all of the archives because it was about 7 archives.
Right.
And the family interviews from Luca, the great-grandson, and Eteri, who was Otar's wife and Alexander's daughter-in-law.
Yeah. It is, you know, I guess there's some joy in these searches, a lot of frustration, but some joy is when you're following a family member, right? And that sort of gives you the focus, finding this person as they move through different societies and places. It
And
must
I
be,
forgot to also mention the Commerce Department archive as well.
oh, the Commerce Department. Okay.
It was important
Yeah,
because it was
exactly. The
industrial
Jacqueline.
investment, yes.
Right, right. Eka.
I was not able to find a lot of resources in Georgian archives or in the Immigration Museum in Georgia because a lot of Georgian diaspora stories have been collected, earlier diaspora stories have been collected by Goram Sharadze,
Yeah.
who on his end, when it comes to Georgian association side of things, relied on Vano Kobakhidze's archives. And Vano Kobakhidze, is known to have collected a lot of information about various Georgians over the years. He's kind of known as like archivist himself of Georgian diaspora in the United States, and before moving to the United States of European diaspora. So I feel like Vano couldn't have had a foresight to collect everything. And so whatever he has, I think he's already been published. But yeah, there is not much in Georgian archives, though yet I have to explore those as well. And the others that I've been able to look at were newspapers.com. Obviously, that has excellent summary of Georgian periodicals from that time, and small town publications like in case of Tamara at that time were covering everything: who was visiting who for tea, and how many guests were there, and what they were drinking and what they were wearing as well. So it is extremely helpful. Some of the records on ancestry.com, for example, in case of Tamara Georgikia, it even mentioned points about her appearance when entering the border, and said like hair, color, complexion, and it had a funny comment that said, "Are her temples big somehow?" Just so very funny little details. And as well as public library in San Francisco, and the Stanford Library.
And you didn't end up in Vladivostok looking at the archives there from the consul?
Not yet.
That's an amazing part of this. The Democratic Republic of Georgia had a consul in Vladivostok.
Yes.
That's funny.
Yes.
Okay, well, we're coming to the end, but we do have this question from Shlomo Tarba, and he says, thanks to the organizers for initiating the webinar and the presenters for sharing their insightful stories. It would be interesting to hear on the future of the immigration from Georgia, starting from the 1990s of the previous century, and its impact on the economy, sociology, and democracy. So Shlomo is asking maybe for you to reflect on the migration that you've studied in the interwar period and the post-war period with what happened in the 1990s and 2000s in Georgia, and what connections or parallels you might be able to see there. So if anybody wants to volunteer, it's a big question. Elena.
I can volunteer because that's the work I kind of have partially done.
Yeah.
my focus was on the interwar period, but I still managed to analyze the Chateau de Neuville as an ethnographic case and to show how the émigré memory that was created in France eventually was received and accepted in the independent Georgia. So all the values that were kind of set out by the émigrés, like being part of the European family, being a democratic country for 100 years old, and the tragic narrative of being occupied by the Soviet Union, those narratives that the émigré memory, the émigrés created in exile, they were eventually transported and reinserted into the Georgian modern national memory or Georgian modern understanding or identity. And so this is a case that shows, and I explained that in my published article, how this émigré memory, which is subaltern or kind of seems like aloof or lost, or insignificant, can become really important if circumstances align. And that's what happened with the with the French émigrés in Leville.
Yeah, excellent. Diana, I'm just wondering, of course, 1990s, Georgia loses, 800, 900,000 people. They go all over the place. Many end up in Russia. Was there a sort of a flow of Georgians into Poland in the 1990s and 2000s that you're aware of?
There was, but I haven't studied this like this cohort of Georgians. Actually, I know some of them. I met some of them, but I don't think I'm going with the research. I mean, actually, there is a great potential on studying Georgians now, because after the visa liberalization, many Georgians came, although who knows how long they will be staying. So it's a rather temporary migration.
Yeah, excellent. Of course, David Kolbaya is, I guess, one of, I don't know when he arrived, but
he is in this cohort, yeah.
Right. Eka, you've got 1 minute.
Sorry, about what? Oh, about this question.
This
Sorry,
question,
yes.
if you want to comment on it.
I mean, no, I know that it's something that is very interesting. I know that you and Nini had started kind of looking into Georgians who moved to the US in 90s and started their own businesses. And I know that information is also available on the website, but yeah, I haven't really looked into it. As someone at the Georgian Association, I'm kind of like trying to reconstruct the history of the organization, understand who we were and how we came to be.
Right. Excellent. Very good. Well, I want to thank you all so much for just, as I say, original scholarship and in terms of the work you've done. And I just want to let the listeners know that we're not going to stop here. We're going to continue working on this. I don't know whether Marcus is with us. Is Marcus still here? Because he could just quickly show that map. Marcus, if you just quickly show the map that of our migrants, and then I think we'll have to stop right there. But
so yeah, I think the main message here is this sort of academic product will be available to everybody on the link that's in the chat. It's the same introduction from our event, and then on this map we have 5 journeys. So Georgi Nakashidze, who was sort of mentioned only a bit here, is also included.
Excellent.
But this gives you a sense of the global scale, the sense that it doesn't only have to be sort of transatlantic journey.
Right.
So we have 2 of these from Eka, the 2 stories through Harbin, included as well. And to my understanding, there is a plan to continue with this project, include more people, and sort of create this.
Well, we're going to populate this map with other Georgian stories. And I want to thank Marcus for doing these maps for us. Just excellent work. And, Marcus is graduating this year, but we might ask him to do some extra work for us at some stage to continue this project. But again, thank you, everybody. You can look at the links in chat, save your links, save the chat links and explore them. Come and visit the Georgian program, the program on Georgian studies at the Davis Center at Harvard, and see what we're doing there with the Diaspora Project, and also the Georgian Association in the USA, which has some wonderful materials on Georgian émigrés in the US. So thank you, everybody, for all the hard work. Thanks for Alison for setting this up, and good luck, everybody. Let's continue this work and expand it into something that will be broadly accessible to anyone interested in this topic. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.